For 3 years, a woman defended a castle against an entire army, using nothing but the garrison she had left and the household staff standing beside her. She won. Twice. And in the end, it wasn't the enemy outside the walls that brought her down. It was one of her own men who opened the gate from the inside. That's not a film plot. That's one afternoon in the real history of a British castle you can walk into for the price of a car park ticket. Britain has more ruined castles than almost anywhere on Earth, and most of them aren't roped-off museum pieces. They're open, crumbling, climbable, and free to wander if you know where to look. These aren't reconstructions with gift shops built into the gatehouse. These are the real broken walls, the real collapsed towers, the real scorch marks from a siege that actually happened. Here are 5 abandoned castles across the UK that you can still explore today, and the very different disasters that turned each one into a ruin. Start on the Isle of Purbeck in Dorset at Corfe Castle. It's been standing in one form or another since William the Conqueror ordered a fortress built here in the 11th century, and for centuries afterward it served as a royal treasury and a prison for the Crown's most dangerous problems. In 1210, a noblewoman named Maud de Breauz and her eldest son were walled up alive in its dungeon and left to starve, on the direct order of King John. That's the kind of castle Corfe was, but its real destruction came much later, during the English Civil War, when Lady Mary Banks held it against parliamentary forces for almost 3 years with barely a garrison to her name, fighting off 2 full sieges. She only lost the castle when one of her own officers, Colonel Pitman, smuggled disguised soldiers inside and opened the gates from within. Once Parliament had it, they didn't just capture Corfe, they destroyed it on purpose, a process called slighting, using gunpowder charges to blow gaping holes through walls that were simply too well built to knock down any other way. It took them months. Walk through Corfe today and you can still see the results. Entire towers sheared clean off and leaning at impossible angles, held up by nothing but sheer stubbornness and 800 years of solid stonework. Locals spent the following centuries quietly helping themselves to the rubble too, and you can still spot chunks of castle masonry built straight into the walls of houses down in the village below. Head north into Warwickshire, and you'll find Kenilworth Castle, which once hosted the longest siege in English history. Back in 1266, rebel forces loyal to Simon de Montfort held out inside Kenilworth against the king's own army for 6 straight months, helped enormously by the castle's most unusual defence. An entire artificial lake called the Great Mere, that King John had flooded around it decades earlier, turning the whole castle into something closer to an island fortress. Kenilworth survived that siege completely intact and went on to become one of the grandest castles in England, later transformed into a lavish palace where Elizabeth I was famously entertained for 19 days straight by her favourite courtier, Robert Dudley. Its ending, though, wasn't a dramatic siege at all. It was bureaucratic. After the Civil War, in 1649, Parliament ordered Kenilworth slighted just like Corfe, tearing down one entire wall of its great tower and draining the Great Mere for good, purely to make sure nobody could ever use it as a military stronghold again. What's left today is a strange, layered ruin. Part Norman keep, part Tudor pleasure palace, all of it roofless, with the drained lake bed now just an open field where you can stand and try to imagine 3,000 soldiers camped around a moat that simply isn't there anymore. Up on the wild Northumberland coast sits Dunstanburgh Castle, and this one wasn't built to keep anyone out so much as to show off. Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, started construction in 1313 as one of the richest and most powerful men in England, second only to the king himself. And he built Dunstanburgh enormous specifically to prove it. It didn't help him personally. He was captured and executed within a decade of finishing it. The castle itself survived him by well over a century, becoming a key northern stronghold during the Wars of the Roses, when it changed hands violently between Lancastrian and Yorkist forces, getting besieged twice in just 2 years, in 1462 and again in 1464. The damage from those sieges was never properly repaired, and the castle spent the following century slowly falling apart, robbed for its stone by anyone who needed building material, until a 16th century official described it as being in what he called wonderful great decay. Today there's no roof, no floors, nothing but a jagged silhouette of broken towers standing on a headland above the North Sea, reachable only by a 1.5-mile walk along the coast path from the nearest village, with waves crashing directly beneath the walls on one side and sheep grazing on the other. Down in Cornwall, Tintagel Castle earns its place on this list for the strangest reason of all. It was never really built for war in the first place. Long before any castle stood here, this dramatic cliff top was an important stronghold of Cornish kings as far back as the 5th century. Trading luxury pottery with the Mediterranean at a time most of Britain had gone quiet after the fall of Rome. Centuries later, a 12th century writer named Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote that this was the very spot where King Arthur was conceived, with Merlin's help, and that single sentence changed everything. In the 1230s, Richard, Earl of Cornwall, a genuinely wealthy and powerful man who happened to be the king's own brother, built an actual castle on the site, despite it having almost no real military value, purely because of the legend already attached to the ground. Tintagel was built essentially as branding. It worked. Tourists and poets, including Tennyson himself, were making the pilgrimage here by the 1800s. And today you'll cross a dramatic modern footbridge just to reach the ruins, split across the mainland, and a rocky headland that the sea has slowly been eating away at for 800 years, with the crumbling walls of a castle built for a myth still standing directly above the waves. Last stop is Old Wardour Castle in Wiltshire, and this is the strangest shape on the list. A genuinely unusual hexagonal design built in 1392 that took its inspiration from French castles rather than the square keeps most of England was building at the time. It was designed for luxury as much as defence, with self-contained guest suites built in for visiting nobility, more like a fortified country house than a true fortress. That softness didn't save it in the Civil War. Parliamentarian forces besieged it in 1643, and it surrendered within 5 days. But the real destruction came afterward, when royalist forces tried to take it back and dug a mine tunnel directly under the walls, packed it with gunpowder, and detonated it, hoping to force the parliamentary garrison inside to surrender. The explosion worked almost too well, collapsing a huge section of the castle and leaving it permanently uninhabitable. Rather than rebuild it, the family who owned Wardour simply built an entirely new castle nearby in the 1770s and deliberately kept the old one as a picturesque ruin in the grounds, landscaping a lake and woodland around the broken walls on purpose. It might be the only castle on this list that was ruined by war and then quite happily left that way, because the wreckage looked better than anything they could have rebuilt. If you actually want to visit any of these, all 5 are genuinely open to the public and don't require anything more than a normal day trip. Corfe Castle is run by the National Trust, sits right above its own village with a working steam railway stop nearby, and is one of the most photographed ruins in the country. Kenilworth and Old Wardour are both managed by English Heritage, with proper car parks, marked paths, and entry fees that are considerably cheaper than a cinema ticket. Dunstanburgh is the wildest of the 5. No direct road access at all, just a scenic coastal walk from either Craster or Embleton that takes roughly 40 minutes each way. And Tintagel, the busiest of the lot thanks to the Arthur connection, now has a dramatic footbridge crossing straight to the headland, though it gets seriously crowded in summer, So an early morning or late afternoon visit is the better move if you want the ruins mostly to yourself. If you're trying to decide which one to start with, it really depends what you're after. Corfu gives you the most complete story in the smallest space, castle, village, and railway, all within a short walk of each other, which makes it the easiest first trip if you're new to ruin hunting. Dunstanburgh is the one to pick if you want scenery over history, since the walk along the coast path is arguably more memorable than the ruin itself. And if you're chasing atmosphere over anything else, go to Old Wardar at golden hour, when the lake in front of it turns the whole broken silhouette into a reflection, and you'll understand immediately why the family who owned it never bothered rebuilding. There's something almost unfair about how quiet these places are most of the year, given what actually happened inside their walls. Women starved to death, 6-month sieges, gunpowder mines, a myth so powerful it got an entire castle built around it for no practical reason whatsoever. None of that is hidden or roped off somewhere you can't reach. It's just stone, standing in a field or on a cliff, waiting for anyone curious enough to go and put their hand on the wall.